But I think this person is not being honest, ma'am. Yeah, it's a freak emergency.
Okay.
Hello interpreters, this is Mason the interpreter. Today I'm going to talk about something that happened several years ago. About this one interpreter who made some terrible mistakes on a 911 call. I actually remember watching this news online when this came out on Fox 8 News. And maybe some of you have already watched the clip, maybe not, but I will leave the link to the news video and the article in the description box in case anyone wants to check that out. Let me first briefly go over what happened, then 3 major mistakes the interpreter made, and finally my thoughts on this incident, and whether it was actually the interpreter that was the problem. If you're ready, let's get started. Here is what happened. The incident happened on August 13th, 2022 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Mr. Diaz was talking with his girlfriend on the phone in his car in front of his apartment he recently moved into. Then suddenly, these 2 men came up and shot Mr. Diaz through the car window. Mr. Diaz was shot twice in his back. He quickly dialed 911, desperately asking for help.
Well, it's 911. What's the location of your emergency?
Hey, español,
Hello?
español.
What's the location of your emergency?
Hey, no, do you think me in my bed? No, no speak too much.
Do you speak Spanish?
Yeah.
Okay, 1 second.
The 911 call center operator then transferred Diaz to an interpreter from the calling service, Voyance.
You will be connected to the next available interpreter. So that your interpreter may better assist you, please speak in short, clear statements.
Hello, my name is Adris, and I will be Spanish interpreter 35.
Acá, una emergencia.
It's an emergency.
Okay, what's the location of your emergency?
The company Voyance, now known as Saracom, provided the interpreter who made severe mistakes of not following interpreter protocols and guidelines on this call that essentially jeopardized Mr. Diaz's life. So, what mistakes did this interpreter actually make? There were so many things that went wrong on this call, but I basically narrowed it down to 3 main ones. And these 3 mistakes go from bad to really bad, then to really freaking bad. Well, here's the mistake number 1, misusing the first person and the third person speaking.
He got a shot, ma'am. He got shot. I don't know, but I cannot move. Please help me. Yeah, he said first that he was at the apartment, and then at the apartment, he didn't know the address.
As you can hear, the interpreter frequently switches back and forth between speaking in the first person and the third person, which is definitely something interpreters should not be doing. In case you're not sure why we have to speak in the first person when we're interpreting, I have a free lecture video and a course posted for free on YouTube, so you can always check that out. To simply explain, as an interpreter, we always want to interpret in the first person and use the I language instead of saying he said or she said to avoid confusion. Another mistake from this interpreter was that the interpreter never properly used intervention protocols. This is usually done by adding identifying remarks such as, "Hi, this is the interpreter speaking," or "This is coming from the interpreter," before saying anything that's not part of interpretation. I always tell my students that we should always say, "This is the interpreter speaking," before we intervene, even when it doesn't feel necessary, because that's the only way we will truly have this in our muscle memory. It is an extremely simple but powerful protocol that many interpreters overlook because often they feel like saying something like this feels unnecessary. But this practice truly shines at a time like this because it will really help us manage call flow better and control the call traffic so there's less confusion. And that is what this interpreter should have done. A second mistake that's really bad was that this interpreter kept adding her own beliefs and opinions.
But I think this person is not being honest, ma'am. Yeah, he said first that he was at the apartment, and then at the apartment, he didn't know the address, and he's new there. And that's kind of weird.
These remarks made by the interpreter, such as saying, I think the person is not being honest, or he doesn't know the address, and that's kind of weird, are all coming from the interpreter's own thoughts and opinions that are most likely biased. There are mainly 4 roles that we take as an interpreter, and the first and most important role is conduit. It means by default, we always stick to delivering messages only. It is also in our code of ethics that we want to stay impartial, which means to be neutral and not add any personal beliefs or opinions. What that means is, even if the client was asking us what our opinion is on something, we are actually not supposed to just provide our opinions. Instead, we first properly state that this is coming from the interpreter. Explain that we must remain impartial to all parties, then we can only provide any observable facts that were obtained during the call, which is what the interpreter should have done. The final mistakes that's just really freaking bad is fabricating or falsifying information.
What is he saying?
He's just different. He's acting, ma'am. It is not a real emergency, but I don't want to hold it. We just need to do whatever you think we should do. But he's telling a different stories all the time.
He's telling a different story. What is he saying?
The interpreter spent more than a minute telling the 911 operator that Diaz might be faking his story. Then 12 minutes and 40 seconds after the initial call, NOPD located Diaz.
Yeah, it's a fake emergency.
Okay, so it looks like the officers did find him.
In my opinion, this is where the issue of this call just got to whole another level. Because saying things like, he's acting, or it's not a real emergency, or it's a fake emergency, is now no longer just a thought or opinion. It's a statement that comes from the only person who can obtain information from the LEP on this call. So saying it's not a real emergency does not have the same gravity as saying, I don't think it's a real emergency. I'm not a legal expert by any means, but I am certain that everyone who is watching this video can tell how dangerous this statement is. Just imagine if the 911 dispatcher simply decided to believe the interpreter and thought this was a prank call. Mr. Diaz could have died, and that would be 100% on the interpreter. So here is my thought on this incident. This is bad. And I truly wish this never happened to anyone, not only for Mr. Diaz, but also for the interpreter. But what's happened, and I think it became a great counterexample to really prove how important it is for interpreters to learn the code of ethics, proper protocols, and guidelines to prevent something like this from happening. I know there are many people who are criticizing the interpreter. I mean, I did too. I was upset that this happened and I blamed the interpreter. But later, when I thought about this again, I actually couldn't stop thinking about how this could have happened to really anybody. It could have been me. I say that because I used to take many 911 calls, and I can tell you from my experience, you do get all sorts of calls, and they are definitely not always emergencies as they seem. For example, I had calls where people needed 911 to open their apartment door. I talked about this once in my lecture video. There was this man who called the police to go arrest his wife who was cheating on him. I had this elderly man once who wanted his 30-year-old son in jail for just one night to teach him a lesson because he doesn't pay rent. Some calls involved LEP who sounded quite confused and agitated, making it extremely difficult for me to interpret. So I can speak from my experience. I understand the feeling.
¿Cuál es la dirección de su emergencia?
Aquí en mi teléfono me metieron un
I've been shot. I don't know what happened.
Señor, ¿cuál es la dirección de su emergencia?
Diaz confirms he was shot, and the interpreter asks where he's located.
No sé, pero no me puedo mover, por favor, ayúdeme.
I don't know, but I cannot move. Please help me.
I'm trying to get some help, but I don't know where you're located.
You see, when I present the news clip this way, you can kind of see how challenging it is to interpret 911 calls with panicking LEPs and angry-sounding dispatchers. When we are watching the news, it's easy for us to understand what's happening because everything is explained. But when you're on a call, you don't necessarily know what's happening right away. So when Mr. Diaz was screaming for help, trying to explain the situation, but also disconnecting himself from the call multiple times, maybe the interpreter started thinking that this was just one of those not an emergency calls she had before. Except this time it wasn't. This thing we call a consensus bias is something we naturally develop as a human being. I am not saying that this justifies the actions taken by the interpreter, but this is probably what caused the issue. So if you ask me if the interpreter is at fault, then my answer is definitely a yes. 100% there is no doubt that the interpreter could have done a lot better. But that doesn't mean that this interpreter had an ill intent, deliberately trying to harm the LEP. In case you are curious about the consequences, Saracom confirmed that the interpreter was no longer employed with the company since November 2022, which was roughly 3 months after the incident. And although this is not confirmed, I heard the company Saracom actually did not lose the contract with Orleans Parish Communication District that handles 911 calls in the area. As to whether the interpreter is still working with any other companies, I do not have any information, but given that most of our work is done by independent contractors, my guess is that this incident wouldn't have had any impact on her employment with other companies. If she is still working as an interpreter, I just hope she learned her lesson, but more importantly, I believe we should all learn from her mistakes. That is it for today's video. What did you think about this incident? Were you shocked? Or did you know something like this would happen sooner or later? I would love to hear your thoughts and input, so please leave them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please click the like button because that will motivate me to keep making more videos like this. Thank you for watching Interpreter Disconnecting. Bye-bye.